you today Katherine Brickell and Mel Nowicki, and they're going to talk to us about their new book and some long-standing research leading up to that book. Katherine is Professor of Urban Studies at King's College London, and her research is feminist in orientation and focuses on everyday domestic and working life, with a particular focus on household debt. Mel is Reader in Urban Geography at Oxford Brookes University and Visiting Reader in Urban Geography also at King's. And her research explores the lived experience of housing precarity and the rise of family homelessness and temporary accommodation in the UK and Ireland. And I'm sure they're going to tell us a lot more, so I'll pass over to them now and join you again for some Q&A later.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people here, and I'm amazed how many people are here online as well. So thank you. Okay. Okay, so since this montage was put together, which was in December 2023, the number of children living in temporary accommodation in England has risen from the figure you could see at the end here, which is 145,000, to 172,000 children. So temporary accommodation is the term that's used to describe accommodation that's secured by a local housing authority under what's known as their statutory homelessness functions. And it can range from bed and breakfasts, hostels, hotels, short stay houses of multiple occupation, to other emerging forms of temporary accommodation, including those that Mel and I have done research on in terms of modular developments, shipping containers and converted office blocks. And as you can see in this latest government map, the geography of households in temporary accommodation is concentrated mainly, but not exclusively, in England's cities, with particular concentrations in London, Manchester and Birmingham. And I don't know how many of you in the room know the statistic for London that 1 in 20 children are homeless in London. So how did we get here? In the English dictionary, a trap is defined as something that prevents escape. It typically allows entry, but it doesn't allow exit, and it catches hold and just does not let go. It works against the interests of those that are trapped. So our new book tells the stories of single mothers in England who have experienced rent arrears and other forms of private debt. They've experienced homelessness and living in temporary accommodation. And they, along with the 172,000 children, are, we argue, caught in a debt trap not of their making. Through mothers' experiences, Debt Trap Nation reveals how debt is not only causing and lengthening homelessness, but it's also outliving it. In researching and tracing mothers' stories over several years, we uncover how families have not simply kind of fallen into a debt trap, but have actually been pulled into it. And we urge the book's readers to question the state-cultivated and politically convenient stigma that equates debt and homelessness with personal failure. And so we argue that it's time to flip this script. It is not women who are failing, women are being failed. Although many individual elements of the debt trap we explore are experienced by a range of different groups, we argue that their cumulative effect is most kind of keenly felt by low-income single mothers. They have been failed on multiple fronts, and throughout the book there is a litany of damning statistics here, and I'm just going to cite a few. So 1/4 of step change debt charity clients, and this is one of the main kind of debt charities in the UK, are single mothers. Now, this is despite the fact that single mothers actually only account for 7% of the whole population. 16% of households who present as homeless to local authorities do so for the explicit reason of domestic abuse. And astoundingly, 1 in 38 single mothers are homeless. 1/3 of households in temporary accommodation, so over 40,000, are headed by single mothers with dependent children. And mothers just generally, including myself as a mother, typically earn 33% less per week than fathers. And this equates to a mother earning nothing from September in a year. So what are the makings of this debt trap? Neoliberalism, privatization, unavoidable austerity, fiscal disciplining, decimated public services, welfare cuts, the 5-week wait between applying and being given funds for universal credit, the shaming of welfare recipients, the spiralling rents that we can see in the private rented sector, the frozen local housing allowance, the cost of living crisis that we all know a lot about, the 2-child benefit cap, low paid work, the poverty tax of being poor and living in temporary accommodation, the necessity of what we call survival debt, brutal government debt collection practices, particularly prescient when it comes to council tax, the hostile environment and no recourse to public funds. And it's women that have been hit the hardest: domestic abuse, coerced debt, impunity, the gender pay gap, unpaid child maintenance, unaffordable and inflexible childcare, caring responsibilities and their devaluation, gender norms, patriarchy, racism, discourses about broken families and failing families, institutionalized empathy deficit, and the minimization of harm being a chronically undervalued skill in government. This isn't necessarily what Mel and I directly say, it's what was said by someone who testified during the COVID-19 inquiry. And I think that is a prescient point to make of what we can currently see more generally. The debt trap's gravitational pull is catching hold of mothers and their children. So former Secretary of State Secretary of State for Housing, Angela Rayner, was not wrong in her first month of her tenure when she said that the numbers of homeless children is a national scandal, which reflected the most acute housing crisis in living memory. Her diagnosis was that there are simply not enough houses to go around, a statement which is plainly correct, but which hides the complexities of why families are becoming homeless. And problem debt is one such complexity, which is all too often lacking in debate on the housing crisis. And it's an omission that we directly challenge in our book. Children and their mothers are being left quite literally out in the cold, homeless, through the accrual of debt and difficulties of repaying it in an economy which is working against them. A roof may have been provided in temporary accommodation, but a home has not. So our book tells the story of a failing state in technicolour. No area of policy failure is left spared. Housing, welfare, employment, health and social care, justice and law, education, transport. The book exposes the self-deception that the housing crisis can be solved solely by building more social housing. So yes, social housing supply is, if not the highest priority. Social housing is a vital key to unlocking the debt trap, but it's simply not enough to dismantle it altogether. And the recent announcement that affordable home targets for developers is likely to be slashed from 35% to 20% provides little comfort that homeless families can put any faith in the promises of large-scale social housing building. Debt Trap Nation points to fundamental economic, societal, and cultural changes which are needed to make a difference to low-income single mothers' lives and those of their children. So what has led, in our view, to the national scandal that Rayner talks about, and also this coining that she makes reference to of a doom loop faced by local authorities who themselves are on the brink of bankruptcy, so often because of the cost of temporary accommodation. Our diagnosis is as follows, many of which you have heard before, right to buy being a key one, the net loss of social housing, the mass transfer to the private rented sector, credit-fueled landlordism, private equity and expansion of residential real estate portfolios, high cost, low security, non-decent PRS, so private rented sector accommodation, rent arrears, evictions, risks of local authority bankruptcy, temporary accommodation owners and brokers who are actively cashing in on this crisis. Is this a form of disaster capitalism, we ask in the book? Yet the onus is still on personal debt management in national policy formation. The idea that problem debt is a house in household's control to avoid, a narrative which conveniently or perhaps deliberately obscures the macroeconomic reasons for that very household debt. It favours discourses of financial illiteracy and or self-indulgence on the part of families. So the debt trap, we argue, is a process of unhoming, an erosion and erasure of home. So the prospect of homelessness, if a woman leaves an abusive relationship, no home to go to, temporary accommodation, the waiting, the limbo of that temporary accommodation, the life on the move that foments, the multiple moves, the out of area relocation that we can see acutely when it comes to London families being moved out of London. Children being ripped away far from their life worlds, from their schools. We can see kind of burgeoning educational inequality. And this is about being not at home in a failing state. So while individuals' debts like those of the women we met are generally very small and negligible in pure financial terms, they're having a huge and disproportionately negative impact on mothers' and children's lives. Their suffering is justified, to use the late David Graeber's words, as a matter of impersonal arithmetic, and by doing so to justify things that would otherwise seem outrageous or obscene. Domestic abuse is feeding the debt trap, and the debt trap is feeding domestic abuse. Many of the low-income single mothers we met were economically controlled, forced to rely on credit for everyday expenses, and in some cases enrolled into coerced debt. When fleeing their perpetrators, or they were commonly leaving with nothing apart from debt. And the feasibility of even leaving had been delayed because of the housing crisis and lack of housing to go to. So as I mentioned earlier, 16% of households who present as homeless to local authorities do so because of domestic abuse. And as we've written recently in an op-ed in the Big Issue, if the government wants to build a reputation for fiscal competence, what about getting to grips with the costs of male violence? Once in temporary accommodation, mothers describe debts carried from a violent relationship and accrued through leaving as another form of punishment, which stays with them. You're on survival mode, we were told. A primary reason why women return to abusive partners are the financial barriers to leading independent lives. Survivors are being entrapped not just by their perpetrators, but by a failing state. Upon fleeing and trying to avoid homelessness, domestic abuse survivors can find their limited financial means, forcing them to live in indecent housing full of disrepair, damp and mould. For several mothers we spoke to, this can mean contending with the harmful power dynamics of a violent ex-partner and the need to confront a landlord who refuses to honour his or her responsibilities to the tenant. Some mothers withheld rent in protest and accrued rent arrears as a result. So they had got nowhere with their landlord. And so, not paying was felt to be the only way to protest that. They also incurred the costs of paying for repairs out of their own pocket and through their unpaid labour. In a failing state, women are trying to hold their landlords to account and are being evicted for it. Women we met were being forced into homelessness through the combination of economic abuse and an unaffordable and insecure private rented sector. But more than this, they had entered the homelessness system in which housing arrears prevented them and their children from actually leaving temporary accommodation. As one participant put it so clearly, you cannot bid for social housing because you're in rent, because you're in the red, so because you're in debt. So this rang alarm bells for us, and we decided to investigate further, and we've analysed all local authority allocation policies in England, so all 294, and this took 3 months full time. This revealed that 88% of the 294 LAs, so this excludes county councils, have a disqualification policy, and 54% have a deprioritisation policy linked to having housing-related debt. Families can, in effect, be left in limbo until they can reduce or clear their rent arrears, or in some cases prove their intent to pay. Our subsequent FOI requests to all local authorities revealed the stark consequences of these policies. So in 1 month alone, when we asked for data, and this was December 2023, local authority allocation rules on housing-related debt barred 4,000 households and TA from social housing. 43% of these households included at least one child under the age of 18, and 5% included a child who was 2 years or under. And so this equates to 1,500 children trapped in temporary accommodation. This is likely a gross underestimate, and I don't know how many of you have done FOI requests, but it's a deeply frustrating process, and invariably you get very little data back. So lots of local authorities could not or would not give us the data. Typical responses to our FOI requests were that we do not hold this information, or this will require a manual trawl through their records, which they declined to do. In short, punitive local authority allocation rules on housing-related debt are driving extended stays in temporary accommodation, and this is something that we've published with Vicky Spratt in the iNews about. So these extended stays are deeply, deeply problematic. They're damaging for families who can experience negative health and educational impacts, and this includes child mortality. So between 2019 and 2024, 74 children died, with temporary accommodation being listed formally as a contributory factor for their deaths. As we know, delayed move-on is also an inefficient and ineffective expenditure of public money, giving the accelerated costs of temporary accommodation to local authorities. The figure daily in London is £5.5 million on temporary accommodation. Worse still, these rules indirectly discriminate against domestic abuse survivors. Less than 1 in 5 local authorities exempt domestic abuse survivors in their allocation policies related to debt. And even within those 1 in 5, the picture is really, really patchy. Very few use language that suggests all survivors in housing-related debt will be exempted. So most exemption policies use phrasing such as may be exempted. So these are far from watertight, and some of the 1 in 5 allude to domestic abuse rather than explicitly stating it. So some, for example, would make mention to harassment as a possible area of exemption for housing-related debt. So the overarching picture is that homeless families, including domestic abuse survivors and their children, are being judged as financially risky tenants rather than as vulnerable individuals and households in need of housing. The Chartered Institute for Housing put it in relation to allocation policies that decisions on who gets access to waiting lists is de facto a process of what they call rationing. Pre-tenancy activity, including rent arrears, risks excluding those most in need of housing.
So while families are kind of left waiting in this limbo in temporary accommodation itself is also a breeding ground for further debts to accrue. So as one of our participants put it, you need to pack up your whole life within hours. So from the cramped spaces of temporary accommodation to experiences of moving between them, typically at speed, sometimes, less than 24 hours notice, sometimes less than 12. This is the breeding ground for the building of debt, trauma, ill health, and as Katherine mentioned in relation to child mortality, risk to life itself. They're stuck here, the debt trap continues to tighten its grip further around families. So no space to raise children, no kitchens, no space to cook, no space for a baby's cot, no space to sleep, no space for children to move around and play, no space for them to meet their developmental milestones, no space to study, no space without mold and damp, no space for belongings, no space to be healthy, no space to be safe, no space to belong, and no space to grow, in essence, boxed in. So I'd like to give you a bit of a further sense of what temporary accommodation is like. So back in 2023, Shelter, the housing charity, teamed up with IKEA to create these real-life showroom sets in 3 of their stores. Some of you might have visited them yourselves. So we went along to the Hammersmith one. So we entered the Hammersmith store and started looking for the real room, this temporary accommodation room set. Going down the escalator, we first passed this kitchen showroom section, your escape to city life. We turned left and were greeted by the design area where we could start planning our dream space now. To make this dream happen, one of IKEA's posters provided the answer: credit. We continued to wander the maze that is IKEA until we found the real room set. We found it opposite a door to a place we call home. Our field notes read: cozy lighting, sofa, rug, mirrors, avenues of stuff, bags to consume. And then Sam's story, one of thousands of homeless families in London. She was homeless in London, slept in a car for 7 weeks while her children stayed at a friend's. Separation and upheaval, now living with her children in a hostel room together. Her family's life in one room. Ripped wallpaper, damp stains, lingering mould, cockroach stoppers, surface-mounted electrics, drafts, beds, so tightly pushed together and in such a small space that walking into the room almost caused me to trip and fall over onto a child's mattress that was laid out on the floor. Battery-powered lights, twinkling, willing some inkling of home, colouring pens assorted, school uniform ready, a toiletry bag perched on the sink, play, learning and well-being thrown but attempted. The rest of the family's belongings banished to bags and suitcases of the displaced, certainly not the holidayed. So a life in limbo. So after leaving the room, we turned the corner to the back of the room set and were faced with a stunning hallway showroom, adorned with botanical wallpaper, shoe cupboards, bench with cushions, lovely lavender-coloured paintwork, all this for a room that nobody really spends time in, a hallway, unlike the real room set where an entire family is cramped in and with nowhere else to go. So these were 2 very kind of stark sets that we encountered in that Hammersmith store. So, stuck in temporary accommodation, debts typically increase for a range of reasons. So the poverty tax of life in temporary accommodation include the costs of being unable to work whilst navigating family homelessness, the cost of being explicitly told not to work because it will complicate welfare access, the cost of takeaways and eating out because of lack of kitchens, the cost of being in food deserts, the cost of moving between temporary accommodation at your own cost and often at speed, as I mentioned earlier. The cost of home to school travel, particularly acute for those being moved out of area. The cost of self-storage facilities, the cost of laundry, the cost of cleaning and DIY products, particularly acute in often appalling quality temporary accommodation. The cost of mothering on the move, the cost of physical and mental health, and the cost to happiness and well-being. Homeless families are being imprisoned in, flung between, and hollowed out financially by political choices that are out of their control. So we also spoke to families who had moved out of temporary accommodation and supposedly into their happy ending of permanent social housing. But even when permanent social housing is provided and the housing allocation debt rules that we talked about earlier overcome, new strands of the debt trap continue to unfurl. As Laura put it, shit housing and a new pile of shit that you have to deal with. Laura was engaged in a never-ending game of whack-a-mole. She said, it feels like everything's getting there and then something else pops up and it knocks you back a bit. So 9% of local authority and 10% of housing association homes don't meet the decent homes standard. Substandard quality, poor insulation, cracks, vermin, and a standard lack of flooring or the tearing up of flooring in between social tenancies can all require borrowing. I mean, I don't know how many of you have, laid new floors in your home. We all know that is a seriously large chunk of money, even for those who aren't in, extreme poverty and debt. So on the lack of flooring, I ask you, how much debt is a child's chipped tooth worth taking on as they fall onto a bare concrete floor? This is one of the thousands of absurd calculations that families across England are having to make every day in a failing state. And again, these choices are especially prolific for domestic abuse survivors, many of whom have been forced to flee and leave everything behind. As I said, building a home from scratch, we know, is a costly process for anyone, let alone those who have extremely limited financial resources, and especially for those where that lack of resources is brought about as a consequence of abuse. So without being given the material ingredients of a safe and comfortable home or the opportunity to earn enough in waged employment to buy them, homeless families in England are being financially flawed and are paying the price for a failing state. And in the afterlife of homelessness, debt continues to creep through the cracks, even when the supposed period of trauma is over. So for some, new debts were also emerging out of the woodworks of their new homes themselves. So often through the debts of previous tenants, most often the case with gas and electricity meters whose previous debts hadn't been cleared, and the amount of extra labour that took to clear those meter debts from some of our participants was astounding, even after everything they had already been through. So some of the women we met were finally free of homelessness, only to move into houses where they couldn't turn on the heating or electricity because of these unpaid meter debts. And we also found that life on the move and regularly changing addresses and tenancy status, again, particularly acute for domestic abuse survivors who are often having to do this at speed across the country, often led to confusion and council errors relating to bill payments, council tax, and the loss of eligibility for some kinds of income support. And someone we worked with said they weren't even able to take out loans because of their new address. They spoke of their new home being kind of blacklisted, that the very house itself was in debt. So in our book, it's not just telling the story of the debt trap and the awfulness of that story. We're also trying to point to some strategies and some hope moving forward as well. So the book argues that a more compassionate and coherent response to poverty, debt, and homelessness is essential and possible. I mean, we start the book with a kind of a vignette, a story of one of our participants and everything that she has been through. And we kind of end the book with an epilogue where this participant has still gone through domestic abuse and homelessness, but her experiences, her interactions with different kind of support services along the way completely change her experiences. So we're not just talking about the big grand scale stuff here, but these piecemeal things as well. So women's life experiences show us that there are lots of opportunities to unpick this mess piece by piece. Jenna, a survivor we met during our research, referred to these as ledges for women and their children to grab onto as they try and surmount this mountainous task that's dealing with debt, domestic abuse, and family homelessness in a failing state. So there are lots of examples of what these ledges could be, such as ensuring the 5 basics in temporary accommodation, a campaign that you might be aware of. Those 5 basics being cooking facilities, laundry access, Wi-Fi access, secure storage, and clear information. Ledges could refer to enforcing the 6-week legal limit for families in hotels and B&Bs. I can't think of a family we met who hadn't superseded that 6-week limit. Minimising out of local authority relocations, improving child maintenance enforcement, making sure all children living in temporary accommodation are eligible for free bus passes, ensuring flooring makes it into the decent home standards, placing a dedicated domestic abuse expert in all local authority housing teams, strengthening interdepartmental dialogue and communication protocols for information sharing, providing more specialised support for homeless parents or parents living in TA to find or stay in work that meets their housing and childcare needs. And importantly, recentering this empathy and harm minimisation in political decision-making and action, i.e. seeing people experiencing homelessness and temporary accommodation as human beings, which sounds so basic, but we unfortunately found severely lacking in some of our conversations with women. So a ledge appeared quite recently, just a few weeks ago, where the government pledged nearly £11 million to help families with children living in temporary accommodation access basic facilities like Wi-Fi, laundry, travel passes. for school and uniforms, and to help pay for food and leisure activities. So this is definitely a positive step in the right direction. It's certainly a first ledge. But our partners at a charitable organisation we work with did some kind of rough calculations and calculated this equates to about £90 per household, which is better than £0 per household, undoubtedly, but ultimately a drop in the ocean. And much more needs to be done to truly tackle this mountainous task of dismantling the debt trap. Okay, so one of our ledges is this reconsideration of debt-related housing allocation rules. We see this as an important next step, and it's something we're pushing as hard as we can. So we're calling on the government to take action to amend regulation to ensure all homeless domestic abuse survivors and their children have the opportunity to access social housing and aren't penalised because of housing-related debt, and which is often coerced debt born out of domestic abuse. So we see this as an opportunity because it's kind of akin to the government recently, earlier in the year, exempting domestic abuse survivors from local connection tests, which became regulation earlier this year. So we see that as a kind of a hopeful blueprint to push the allocation side of things forward. So we're working currently with the Chartered Institute of Housing, so we're working on the kind of the national scale push, and we've been working with barristers at Garden Court Chambers on this, but we're also writing a best practice guide along with the Chartered Institute of Housing for local authorities, asking how, and housing providers, I should say, actually, are highlighting how they can better support survivors in debt and experiencing or at risk of homelessness. So one of our core recommendations there, again, will be to exempt all survivors from these housing-related debt rules in individual allocation policies. So we're trying to tackle this issue of discrimination in allocation policies and the reconsideration of debt at both the national and the local scale. One of the reasons we're so passionate about pushing this is that these policies aren't only clearly immoral, but they're also potentially unlawful. So in our conversations with some of the barristers who are specialists in social housing allocations law, they confirmed that if local authorities are excluding domestic abuse survivors from allocations lists on the basis of housing-related debt, and those debts are a direct consequence of domestic abuse, then that's discriminatory, potentially on the basis of sex, and could be, or they were very adamant that it would be unlawful under the Equality Act of 2010. So next month, we're going to the London Assembly Housing Committee to communicate this further. We've been invited as expert panellists in their evidence session on social housing allocations. These issues are all very much nationwide now, but London remains the absolute epicenter, and we're really hoping to kind of push that at this London Assembly Committee. And we're hoping to pursue strategic litigation, given that there's currently no case law on this issue, and that can make a real difference as well. So in this talk, we've taken you briefly inside the debt trap. Just as many housing campaigners ask us to imagine living in temporary accommodation to make their case for change, I hope that we've helped you to imagine what living within the debt trap is like, what it feels like. Being evicted as a result of debt, possibly also domestic abuse, caught and held in prison-like temporary accommodation by that debt, only to find that life after homelessness doesn't always come with an afterlife from debt, that this debt trap continues. And in the book, we're urging for a political movement against guilt and the outsourcing of blame to low-income single mothers for personal debts born out of factors that are largely out of their control. And we also ask, what about the huge debt that society owes women and mothers for the work of raising children? This is a debt that's rarely acknowledged and certainly, not repaid. What's been clear from our research and the writing of this book is that England is caught in a more than housing crisis. We're beyond referring it to as a housing crisis now, I think, that is failing women and children, including survivors of domestic abuse. And now more than ever is the time to act and begin that long and difficult task of dismantling the debt trap. So thank you very much for listening. Here is a link to the book, and we've also dished out some flyers as well if you're interested. So thank you.
Thank you. Amazing. So we've got plenty of time now for any questions or comments. Anybody online, if you'd either like to raise